So, since biology is the study of life, we need to have a discussion about what it actually takes for something to be alive and what are those characteristics that define living things. So, I have my fish to help us with this. So, what does it take to be alive? We use terms and we talk about certain things being alive that really aren't alive. Like computers, for example, aren't alive. They can do things, but they don't have those characteristics of living things. So, from a biological perspective, what makes something alive? So, living things either have to have the following characteristics or do the following things. Living things have to be made of cells, like a cell. They have to be able to reproduce. They have a genetic code. They have some DNA. They grow, develop, they use materials and energy, they eat, if you will, and they maintain homeostasis. So let's take a look at each of those characteristics here, and while the fish eat some of the food I just gave them behind us. All right, so first off, living things must be made of cells. There's nothing alive that is not made of a cell. So viruses are a really good example of something that seem like they're alive, but they are not made of cells, so technically they really are not alive. They're just some DNA and a protein. They do not have all of these different organelles and structures that bacteria, fungus, plants, animals, protists that we all have, right? So you must be made of a cell. Now, some living things are made out of one cell, like bacteria are one single cell, whereas humans are also alive and we're made out of trillions and trillions of cells, a lot of cells. So you can be unicellular and be single-celled, or you can be multicellular and be mini-celled. Either way, you've got to have a cell to be alive. Living things must be able to make more of themselves. So let's go back to viruses. Viruses cannot on their own make more of themselves. They must invade a cell, hijack their cellular machinery with their own DNA, and then use their DNA to tell the cell to make more viruses. They cannot on their own make more viruses. Living things are able to make more of themselves. Okay, and they can do this in a couple different ways. One, there is asexual reproduction, which means the prefix a before something means not, so it's not sexual. So that means that you do not need more than one genetic donor for it. Asexual reproduction is one genetic donor. A good example are our bacteria. One single bacteria can split into two bacteria through a process known as binary fission. They don't need any sexual partners. They don't reproduce using sex anyway, and so that's how they can reproduce. Many fungi can do that. Different types of fungus can reproduce asexually, like yeasts are an example of an organism that can do this. Some plants reproduce asexually by making little buds that can break off and then grow a whole new little plant from that. We use that in plants by going up to plant, clipping a little bit off, sticking in some soil, we grow a new plant. Hey, that's asexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, because there's only one genetic donor, the offspring are going to be exactly like the parent. Okay? They're identical genetically. That's why most things don't use asexual reproduction and they use sexual reproduction. And all that means is that there's more than one, like there's two genetic donors. Okay? And each of those genetic donors donate half of the genetic material to the offspring. Therefore, the offspring is not exactly like either parent. Biology, nature loves variety. The more genetic variation you have in a population, the better off that population is, because you've got more organisms with different characteristics. So diversity is great in nature. That means you'll be well suited to whatever conditions come along. You'll be somebody in that population will be pretty well suited for them. So that's why most things reproduce by sexual reproduction. Okay, two genetic donors. Now, side note, don't get caught up in the whole male and female thing. That's great for mammals because there's obviously males and obviously females. But whenever you get into things like fungus, it's kind of a better way to think of mating types. There's a really common fungus that grows on trees around here. And I think there's like 120 some different mating types, and they can only mate with certain other mating types. So it gets weird, and it's not how we normally think of it. But it's still sexual reproduction in that you have two genetic donors, even though it's not a male and a female, because they don't have male and females. They have type 1 and type 97 and type 120 something, right? So it's slightly different than how we oftentimes view it. But it's still sexual reproduction, two genetic donors, asexual reproduction, one genetic donor. All living things make more of themselves by either one of those processes. Okay, living things have a genetic code. Every living thing has DNA in it. There is no living thing that we've come across yet, and probably don't think we will, that doesn't have DNA in it that is the way of it storing its genetic code on how to build itself. That is why it's such a big deal that currently we've got all this technology with genetic modification and the CRISPR gene editing technique and all this stuff we've been doing with DNA. It's a big deal because every living thing uses the exact same type of DNA to write its code. So when you're able to alter, us are able to alter any genetic code, we're changing organisms at a fundamental level. There's no lower level by which we can change organisms. So it's a really big deal. We'll talk quite a bit about DNA and what that entails for us. All living things use materials and energy. Living things need energy to stay alive. If you are not using energy anymore, you're dead. Like many of your Chromebooks are dead, probably. I hope not, right? They're not using energy anymore, right? So it's exactly the same with living things. These guys behind me, they need energy to stay alive, so they're eating to get that energy. Now, plants, like this scummy algae stuff right here, it's not eating to stay alive, but it's still using energy by getting sunlight and doing photosynthesis, right? So some terms that will go with that would be the idea of a autotroph or a heterotroph. Autotrophs can do it themselves. They make their own food to eat, plants, algae, things like that. Heterotrophs have to find something different and eat it, like the fish and us. Collectively, living things, as they're using energy, have a metabolism. They have chemical reactions going on inside of them. If you have no more chemical reactions going on inside of you, you're probably not alive anymore. There's no chemical reactions in this rock, it's dead. All right. It's also not made of cells and it doesn't have DNA. Okay, living things respond to their environment. Now, it's really easy to see that these living things in the tank behind me are responding to their environment. I threw some food in there. They're like, yeah, we're responding to that. He finally fed us. It's harder to see how other things are responding to our environment. Maybe a tree is a good example. We don't think trees really respond. It's not like when we come at them with a chainsaw, they run away. They can't do that. But still, if you think about it, you've probably seen trees around that have grown towards the light. Like there's some two trees, and one kind of grows this way to grab some of this light coming down from up here. That is responding to its environment. All living things do this to some extent. Sometimes it's hard for us to see that because it happens slowly or happens very at a microscopic level. But all living things do that to some extent. Finally, living things maintain internal balance on the inside. That is, they maintain homeostasis. That term homeostasis is an important idea, that all living things are going to keep conditions inside their body different from conditions outside their body. They're always going to maintain certain things. For humans, we could say, like, we want to maintain an internal body temperature of, 98.3 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius. We always want that exact body temperature. Whenever you start looking at other things, though, you say, well, we also want a certain amount of water in our body. We also want a certain amount of dissolved things in our bloodstream, like potassium or sodium. We have to have a certain amount of sugar in our blood. If you get low blood sugar, that's not good either. You cannot function. So we as a living thing have a certain levels of all these materials in our body that we keep a certain way. And if it's not within those levels, we quit functioning very good. We get too hot, we don't work very good. We get too cold, we don't work good. It will kill us if we get too hot or too cold. And it's not even that much above our normal body temperature. So those are things that all living things, whether you're a single cell or you're multicellular, you want to maintain certain levels of materials in your body, and that all those processes collectively is called homeostasis. Stasis means keeping things the same. All right, so we want to maintain the stable internal body conditions. So once again, living things, I'll go back up to my list. Okay, you have cells, you reproduce, you have a genetic code, you've got DNA, you grow, you develop, you have the need to use materials and energy. You got to eat or find energy somewhere, and you must maintain homeostasis. You also respond to your environment in some way, shape, or form. So that's what it takes to be alive.